the Bible in the 21st century. We're looking at various themes as they're taught in the Bible, and in this series we're focusing on end times. What does the Bible teach about end times? We've now reached presentation 8, where we're going to start to look at Revelation chapters 20 to 22. This is going to take two presentations, presentation 8 and 9. The focus of this presentation is going to be very much on the millennialisms and their meaning for us today. And the next presentation will move that forward to look at what happens at the very end, when the whole world is wrapped up finally by Jesus. Let's just look back at the previous presentation to see where we've come from. We've looked at the book of Revelation in an overall sense as a mysterious book which has generated all kinds of strange views and opinions, because it's full of strange images and events that puzzle us with our Western mindset. But this is simply because it's a form of literature that's rarely seen today. But it occurred way back 2,000 years ago. So it is a form of literature, and we must interpret it that way. But it was written for specific groups of people in the southwest corner of what's now Turkey, who were facing horrendous persecution. The book describes itself as a prophecy, an apocalypse, translations call that revelation, but the word is apocalypse, and letter. Prophecies, a prophet speaks out the mind of God for a specific situation, so addressed to specific people in a specific context. But it also follows the normal letter format, and it was circulated and read to various groups of people in that part of the world, in southwest Turkey. Characteristics of the apocalyptic type of literature: it's a carefully worked out literature format. Things tend to come as dreams, tend to come as visions. The language is cryptic, symbolic. Numbers are used entirely in a symbolic sense, not literalistically. Usually it's anonymous, but because it's also a letter, we know who the author is. So an apocalypse is a form of literature to convey ideas, and it does it in this way, and John uses this way simply because if it got into the hands of the Roman authorities, they wouldn't have a clue what it meant, but it would make sense to the followers of Jesus as they faced persecution in the Roman Empire. That's the context. Persecution had come and gone over the decades. We're now in the last decade, the 1st century. And it had increased, and it was increasing. It's becoming brutal. And the followers of Jesus were just not knowing what to do. Why is this happening to us? How do we cope? Do we survive? Is there any future in this? And John is showing them and putting their sufferings in a spiritual context. And the message is subversive. That's why it has to be apocalyptic, so it doesn't make sense to the Roman authorities, because it speaks of the fall of the Roman Empire and its destruction. That's subversive, and we get an automatic death penalty. That's what John's doing. Faced with this period of intense persecution, which had started and was going on and getting worse, John kind of lifts the lid through this apocalyptic language to show his hearers what's going on in the spiritual realm. Why is this happening? What's the outcome? Is it worth keeping going? It's a word of encouragement. And he makes it clear it's for the then and now. The time is near. So fundamentally the book is not about end times. It's dealing with a real issue of violent persecution. But it has enormous significance for end times, particularly the last 3 chapters, which is the focus of this presentation and the following one. That's the significance and meaning of the book. And if we keep that in mind, it helps us to make sense of the end times ideas that occur in the book and that are so important for us today. Now let's look at Revelation 20, but a word of warning. Confusion is likely. The problem is we come to this with a Western mindset, and we forget that this book is an apocalyptic form of literature written towards the end of the 1st century AD to a culture and situation that was very, very different. So if we're travelling along the road of the book, we're faced with things like pre-millennialism, post-millennialism, a-millennialism, and we merely scratch our heads and wonder what it's all about. And this is what so many followers of Jesus have ended up going down the right-hand route. Lostness, confusion. What's this all about? Can't sort it out. Now we've got to remember that these ideas of pre, post and a-millennialism are human inventions. You won't find these words in the text. And let's remember that we interpret the text in the light of why John wrote it and the significance of it for the original hearers. The tragedy is this book has been a happy hunting ground for views that are simply bizarre. And then, even more tragic, people holding one view dogmatically state that their view is the only view, they are correct, and all the other views are wrong. That doesn't take us forward at all. So this is a real problem area which we've got to address and look at with honest integrity. I'm going to read through chapter 20, the first few verses. It takes 3 frames just to get the overall picture. Then we'll go down into it. Now I'm not going to do everything and explain everything, even if I could, in these sections, because we're looking at all of this in the context of end times, not in general terms. This is what John saw, and it's a visionary experience. I saw an angel coming down out of heaven, having the key to the abyss, holding in his hand a great chain. He seized the dragon, that ancient snake, who is the devil or Satan, bound him for 1,000 years. That's the origin of millennial. He threw him into the abyss and locked and sealed it over him, to keep him from deceiving the nations any more until the 1,000 years were ended. After that he must be set free for a short time. I saw thrones on which were seated those who had been given authority to judge, and I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded because of their testimony about Jesus and because of the word of God. They had not worshipped the beast, that's Rome, or its image, that's the facsimiles of the emperor, and had not received its mark on their forehead or their hands. That's the kind of certificate to say that they'd gone through this religious ritual. They came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy are those who share in the first resurrection. The second death has no power over them, but they will be priests of God and of Christ and will reign with him for 1,000 years. Moving on. When the 1,000 years are over, Satan will be released from his prison and will go out to deceive the nations in the 4 corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, and to gather them for battle. In number they are like the sand on a seashore. They marched across the breadth of the earth and surrounded the camp of God's people, the city he loves. But fire came down from heaven and devoured them, and the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of burning sulphur, where the beast and the false prophet had been thrown. They'll be tormented day and night forever and ever. And it goes on, then I saw a great white throne, and him who was seated on it. The earth and the heavens got fled from his presence, and there was no place for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne. And books were opened. Another book was opened, which is the book of life. The dead were judged according to what they had done, as recorded in the books. The sea gave up the dead that were in it, and death and Hades gave up the dead that were in them. And each person was judged according to what they had done. Hades is the correct translation. It's a transliteration of the original word in the Greek, which means the shadowy place of the dead. Older versions translate it as hell. That's very misleading. Hades has a meaning in the Greek language: shadowy place of the dead. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. The lake of fire is the second death. Anyone whose name was not found written in the book of life was thrown into the lake of fire. Now that gives a kind of overall picture of the first 15 verses. Let's look at it in a kind of overall sense. Let's remember John's purpose. He's writing to encourage those who will face martyrdom for allegiance to Christ. Emperor worship was being imposed on the Roman Empire. If you didn't conform, you were executed. How were the followers of Jesus to cope with that threat? In the sequence in the book of Revelation, it follows the destruction of the beast from the sea and the beast from the land. Now these are identified as anti-God political power, which is supported by corrupted spiritual power. In the case of John's days, the Roman Empire, supported by the religious system. Verses 1 to 6 come before the final judgment of all, which is in this latter part of the bit we read, and that leads into chapter 21, which pictures a new heaven and a new earth. Now this is assuming that it follows a logical time order. It might not, because time was not thought of that way in those days, and apocalyptic literature certainly didn't think of time that way. But if it's in a sequence, and that's an if, verses 1 to 3 speak about an angel locking up Satan. Some kind of recognition for the martyrs. The destiny of Satan is described, and then the destiny of humanity is described. Now, whether these are in a logical order or simultaneous, or illustrate deeper spiritual principles, we cannot be sure. So I put a warning down there. This fits somewhere between the fall of Rome and the end of the age, if it follows a time sequence. But John doesn't follow strict Western logic. It wasn't invented in his days. So it might not relate to time or a sequence of things at all. The passage could be looking at major issues related to persecution, totally unfair persecution, from yet another standpoint. And there's a lot of evidence in the early chapters of Revelation to suggest that there's an element of truth in that. So John could be describing fundamental principles which were working out in the persecution of the day and would work out repeatedly down through history to the end of time. And perhaps that's a useful way to look at it. So let's be careful we're not being too dogmatic. If you look at the first 3 verses, 3 words or phrases are used to describe Satan. That describes Satan as Satan, the Hebrew word, adversary, accuser. That's his nature. He generates chaos wherever he goes. God brings order. Satan tries to reverse it. And devil comes from the Greek word to translate Satan, which carries somewhat similar meanings in the Greek language: false accuser or slanderer. So we've no doubt who we're talking about here. And the picture's being bound for 1,000 years and chained in the abyss. And somehow this stops worldwide deception, then he's freed for a short time. Now we tend to think of this as a one-off. Maybe this illustrates a principle that repeats itself. Let's look at the word abyss. The word is used 9 times in the New Testament, and from these we can deduce that it's a place where demons are imprisoned, the evil angels of Satan. It's the place where the beast, that's the Roman Empire, well, it's not the Roman Empire, but it's all the evil that overtook the Roman Empire, which was growing in the days of John. It came out of the abyss, out of the place of Satan and demons. And the aim of it all is just destruction of all God's creation, creating disorder, chaos. Now looking at the end bit of it, he's released from the abyss. He now deceives the nations. Huge numbers seek to destroy God's people. Then he's defeated. We tend to think of this as a one-off. Maybe it's picturing a pattern that repeats itself. We'll come back to that in a moment. Perhaps John is suggesting that. Why does God just not wipe off Satan and wipe off evil? Difficult question to answer. But in some way, evil needs to be exposed for what it is, which means it's got to be allowed to do its worst. And if you think about the cross, that's what Jesus did. Jesus exposed the utter evil and allowed his whole body and life to be destroyed in torture on a Roman cross, so that people could see just how bad it was. And in the process of suffering love, Jesus defeated it. There's a great principle here. Satan does have enormous power, and he can make the lives of the followers of Jesus misery at times, but his power is limited by God and his time is limited. And finally, that's his destiny. John pictures it as a lake of fire. It's the worst kind of picture he could have in his day, in an area where there were volcanoes. The lava flow, instant destruction of everything. It's a picture, not literal. That's apocalyptic literature. Now let's focus in on verses 4 to 6, having looked at it overall and its context. And remember, we're looking at this in the context of its significance for end times, not all the detail of the whole of the book of Revelation. John saw thrones, people given authority, the souls of those who have been beheaded because they've been faithful to Jesus. They hadn't worshipped the beast. They hadn't gone into their temples in the Roman Empire with their pinch of incense and bowed down and worshipped the facsimile of the Roman emperor. And they hadn't got their certificate to say they'd done it. And what John is saying to these people, you lose your life. And many of the people to whom he was writing, their friends had already lost their lives. Maybe their husband or their wife had lost his or her life. And what John is saying, they came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. They've got some kind of preeminence because they were faithful and paid the ultimate penalty. And he speaks about a first resurrection and a second death. And 1,000 years comes in a few times. Let's look at that in a little more detail. It's derived in large measure from ideas that are in the book of Daniel. John has borrowed the language. He's borrowed the thought forms. And there's a picture in Daniel. It's worthwhile reading the whole of chapter 7. Because Daniel pictures a heavenly courtroom. He pictures in his visions, and it's apocalyptic at this part, a brutal and violent kingdom. We now know with hindsight he's describing the Roman Empire. Its leader, the emperor, waged war on the saints, Daniel's word. We now know that's the followers of Jesus. And the followers of Jesus suffered for a period of time. History shows Daniel had it right. He pictured 4 kingdoms, one after the other. He described them accurately. God had lifted the lid so that Daniel could see what was facing the people of God. But there's a heavenly courtroom. Remember, it's apocalyptic literature, not literalistically to be interpreted. God's court sits in judgment. Judgment's passed on Rome, and it's passed in favour of the followers of Jesus. They've suffered unfairly. And Daniel is told, but the court will sit, and his, that's the Roman Empire's, power will be taken away and completely destroyed forever. History shows that happened. The Roman Empire, as it were, imploded under its gross evils and was destroyed. But the kingdom of God went on. Then the sovereignty, power, and greatness of all the kingdoms under heaven will be handed over to the holy people of the Most High. The followers of Jesus started to make impact on all the people groups round about. The kingdom of God grew. People were drawn into the kingdom. His kingdom, that's the kingdom of Jesus, will be an everlasting kingdom. And all rulers will worship and obey him. Daniel's picturing something that did happen, and history shows it. We've got to remember that's why John was writing. These little groups of followers of Jesus meeting in each other's homes to support each other, facing this onslaught of brutal persecution. That was the likely outcome. Now just imagine you were in that position. What would you feel? How would you cope? This would haunt you. Why is it happening? Why does God not intervene to stop it? These are the kind of questions that you and I would probably ask, and the people who were facing this were probably asking too. John wrote it, as it were, to lift the lid and show what was happening in the spiritual realm, and to give them insights so they could make sense of this, that they could face this with courage, knowing the eventual outcomes. That's what John is saying. God would see them through. They wouldn't lose out. There'd be resurrection. There'd be transformation to something glorious and wonderful. God would put things right. God is the God of justice. And there would be infinite blessing in his presence. And implicit in this is the truth that Jesus was with them as they faced this onslaught of suffering. And whatever life was going to throw at them, Jesus would be with them and would not let them down and would take them through. Now that's a powerful message of encouragement to people facing brutal persecution. That's what John is doing. It is not primarily a book about end times, but it does throw a lot of light on the nature of end times, which is why it's so important that we grapple with the issues. But it's certainly not that. If you think about it, what on earth would a celestial timetable, what value would that have for these people? What would they make of it? Lay a great way ahead in the future. But John wasn't writing for that purpose. We don't need or want celestial timetables, and our desire in the West today to seek them, as it were, to read the future. Our desires are misplaced. That's not what John was doing. Now, with that kind of background in mind, we're back to verses 4 to 6 again, which are the central verses that have that word 1,000. We don't know who'd been given authority to carry out the judge, and perhaps we don't need to know. It's not important. But there will be authority to judge given to somebody. There are many words in the original language that could be translated judge. The word used here has got a kind of emphasis on giving the verdict. That through this courtroom picture coming from Daniel, a verdict would be pronounced on those who had perpetrated this brutal persecution, and God's people would be vindicated. The word soul there speaks of not yet resurrected. And it takes us back to something that John wrote way back in chapter 6. Again, remember, not literal, it's apocalyptic language. I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain because of the word of God and the testimony they had maintained. And they called out in a loud voice, "How long, sovereign Lord, holy and true, until you judge the inhabitants of the earth and avenge our blood? This is so unjust. Why are we suffering?" Oh, how many people have cried that out with good justification. And each of them was given a white robe, and they were told to wait a little longer until the full number of their fellow servants, their brothers and sisters, were killed just as they had been. The white robe of purity. Patience. It will come to an end. Can't tell from the English, but the verb that's used there has got an emphasis on something that is a specific event. And if you think about it, resurrection can occur only once. It is specific, and that's what it's referring to. John is telling these people, you've lost your lives, you're going to lose your lives, but you will be resurrected. And 1,000 years is not literal. It's a symbolic of a perfect period of time. We can't be certain what's meant there. Does it mean all those except the martyrs, the followers of Jesus who just died natural causes? Or does it refer to those who are not in God's kingdom? I tend to the latter, but I would not be dogmatic. First resurrection? Well, you can't have a second one. What it means is the first to rise. In some way, those who had given their lives, the ultimate penalty they had paid, in some way they are being specially honoured. That's the martyrs. Resurrected first, given some sort of honour. Words of encouragement to those who were suffering and about to suffer more. But let's look at this mysterious 1,000 years. Gives us the phrase millennialism, which has caused so many arguments and so many disputes. We've got to remember John always uses numbers symbolically. And 1,000 just means a perfect period of time. But why this period of time? What John is saying, what he's communicating, the message is getting across through the apocalyptic language is that there will be a vindication within history of the cause of Christ. And if you think about it, the vindication came, Rome fell, the kingdom of Jesus went on. That's just one vindication. There is a special reward for martyrs, and that's somehow connected with this. Those who had sacrificed everything, being faithful to Jesus. And it goes back to what Jesus himself says, whoever finds their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. Now you could interpret that at multiple levels, but at the ultimate level of martyrdom, what Jesus is saying is you won't lose out. And that was such an important message for the people to whom John was writing. But people have asked, where does all this fit? How does it relate to the return of Jesus? Does it come before the return of Jesus or after the return of Jesus? But there's always the possibility. Is it a period of time at all in the sense that we use time? They didn't think of time that way in those days, and apocalyptic literature certainly didn't use time that way. And indeed, the idea of time is greatly misunderstood in our society today, as the research of the last 100 years from physics has shown. What do we mean by time? We've been created to live on this planet within time. But time is by no means as fixed as we think it is, as Einstein has showed us. So maybe we're coming at this with a rather naive Western mindset, and we're not actually seeing what John is driving at. I raise that as a possibility. There are other things that tie in with this mysterious 1,000 years. It speaks about Satan being restricted for a period of time. Now, if you look back over history over the last 2,000 years, there's no evidence of satanic restriction. There have been repeated eruptions of violent persecution of the followers of Jesus. And indeed, in some countries today, the followers of Jesus are going through the most horrendous persecution at the hands of political and religious authorities, sometimes combined. But it isn't as simple as that. Look back to what John said a bit further back. They, that's the followers of Jesus, triumphed over him, that's Satan, by the blood of the Lamb. Jesus died on the cross to rob Satan of his ultimate power. We walk in that. They triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. By living it out, by speaking it out, by living by it, we declare a victory over Satan. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death, even to martyrdom. And that would have meaning for the people to whom John was writing, because that's what they were facing. Martyrdom, in some wonderful way, restricts Satan's power. You can summarize it that way. When we bring testimony to what Jesus has done, even to the point of risking our lives, Satan is weakened. When Satan is weakened, he cannot deceive the nations overall. But he's still seeking to gather the people groups of the world against God's people to destroy them and to destroy the markers. But he cannot do these. He is restricted, and he's restricted by the victory over Satan by Jesus on the cross, which we carry forward by living and speaking for Jesus, even risking our lives in the process. There are very deep thoughts here, and it seems that John is driving at that. And the 1,000 years is very much a secondary issue. You see, connected with martyrdom, it does restrict Satan. Look at the history of the world. When the followers of Jesus are persecuted violently, and some are killed or tortured, the growth of the kingdom is seen to follow. More and more people come to Jesus when they see the followers of Jesus in suffering love, facing the most awful punishments. Happening today. You can see it in China. You can see it in North Korea. You can see it in some Islamic states. It's happening today. Martyrdom opens the eyes of people who see the people who are facing martyrdom, and they do it in suffering love. And Satan can no longer deceive them. It does have an impact. Martyrs are honoured, and honour and power is released. History shows that's true. But Satan will mount a final showdown, but he'll be defeated. And he'll be finally removed. These are words of encouragement to the hearers. Satan is restricted for a period of time, and it's happened again and again. It's connected with martyrdom, but martyrs will be resurrected throughout. It's connected with deceiving the nations, and when Satan is restricted, there is a flood of people entering the kingdom. I could call the period from the death and resurrection of Jesus till now the reign of the martyrs. But let's remember in the chapter, there is no reference at all to the return of Jesus. And if John didn't see fit to put it in, why do we try to relate this mysterious 1,000 years to the return of Jesus? We're missing the point. Summarizing it, martyrdom, it leads to a chaining of Satan. And history shows that is true. And in the end of day, Satan will face ultimate destruction. And if you like, Satan is bound by martyrdom. That's the significance of what John is saying. Satan is bound by martyrdom. But there's an ultimate martyrdom, and that's what Jesus achieved. Suffering love when he died under torture on a Roman cross. He brought Satan's power down. And when we live by that, when we declare it, and we declare it by our living, we are weakening Satan. We're helping to chain him so that people can be released and set free. That's the message John is declaring to his hearers. Let's look at this mysterious millennialism just a little bit more. This is a summary of the kind of views. Now, we've got to remember here two things. Firstly, I'm giving a summary which is simplified just so it's intelligible to us. There are variations and variants on this. And secondly, all of this are simply based on human inventions. Now, we don't like to hear that said, but if you look at the history of it, it's true. In pre-millennialism, the return of Jesus comes, there's 1,000 years and a final judgment. In post-millennialism, there's 1,000 years, then a final judgment following the return of Jesus. A-millennialism, return of Jesus and final judgment occur together, and all time, from the days of Jesus till this happens, is a millennium. Now, these are the three kind of views that are seen in simplified form, and there are variants on this. But they're human inventions, and they don't really relate to what John was trying to communicate to his hearers. If you look at the history of this, at the beginning there were all sorts of interpretations, but it wasn't regarded as very important. Tended to be more towards pre-millennialism, but they thought of the 1,000 years as symbolic. That's wise, maybe we could learn something from it. Augustine brought in post-millennialism. In a sense, it was nearer a-millennialism, but it was called post-millennialism. But after 1,000 years literally had come and Jesus had not returned, it was very strongly towards the a-millennialism ideas. Things just went all over the place after that. All sorts of speculations and opinions flew around. Till somewhere towards the end of the 18th century into the 19th, pre-millennialism was kind of reinvented. Brought in the idea of rapture. We'll look at that in the final presentation. And people started to predict when Jesus would return, and when he didn't return, then there was disillusionment, and that generated other groups on the fringes of Christianity. But premillennialism started to be discredited, and it moved into what we call dispensationalism. These terrible words that are just human inventions. They don't relate to the real biblical text. Dispensationalism is the idea of ages following one after the other. With the formation of the Plymouth Brethren, the 19th century, which came from one person, this developed a highly literalistic view of the Bible, and it started a development of what we could call pre-millennialism dispensationalism. Difficult to put your tongue around that lot. But it was based on a highly literalistic view of the Bible. And that kind of view just cannot be sustained. Then in the 20th century, Israel started to be brought in as well, and the rapture ideas started to take a higher profile. We'll look at all this in the final presentation. But it's had a major grip on many churches in the United States and is filtered across to the West and can be seen in many churches. It's an area of utter confusion and tragic dogmatism, and much of it is based on ideas that look at the Bible literalistically. You can take any phrase, sentence, word, rip it out of context and make it mean what you want it to mean. That's no way to treat any book. But the key point is this: the passage in Revelation never mentions the return of Jesus. And if John chose not to mention it, maybe we've got this completely wrong. And it's nothing to do with trying to tie it up to the return of Jesus. There are implications from this. That's the summary of the two positions. We do know Satan has been active over the past 2,000 years or so, but we also know that it's curtailed by faithful witness and martyrdom. Premillennialism fits in with a specific literalistic interpretation of Thessalonians, and we've looked at that and shown that's an impossibility. Postmillennialism doesn't require that. Overall, premillennialism tends to be pessimistic. The world's getting worse and worse. It's going to an utter destruction, cataclysmic end. Therefore, if that's what's going to happen, why bother about looking after the planet? Whereas postmillennials tend to be more positive, optimistic, and focuses more on establishing God's kingdom here and now, and looking after the planet. And all these speculations, because that's all they are based on that little section from Revelation. What I'm suggesting here is we've lost the place. We've missed the point of what John is seeking to communicate. We've missed it because we've forgotten why John was writing. We've missed it because we've not understood the nature of apocalyptic literature. We've missed it because we haven't understood that time and number are very different things at that time. You see, we tend to think in the West of a logical time dimension. Things happen in a sequence. We tend to think of location in terms of a place with specific coordinates. What Einstein shows is that this is utterly inadequate. The concept of space-time is a better model. It fits the evidence more completely. But at the spiritual level, space-time coordinates has no meaning. We're interpreting it the wrong way. We think of heaven and earth as entities, places. They're not. They're qualities of living. And indeed, much of Revelation 20 is set in heaven, and we don't even know how time exists in heaven, even if the time is there at all. Oh, we've got to be so cautious. Therefore, worrying about time and location in trying to interpret this, it may be not very helpful. It may be the wrong way forward. We're looking at this the wrong way. John is conveying meaning, and is conveying it in apocalyptic language which would be intelligible to the early hearers. The millennium, if you like, looks back. God will vindicate those who die in his name, and he has done so. But God will vindicate those who suffer for Christ in eternity. John's key message here never mentions parousia, the return of Jesus. He's not thinking in terms of time. That just means a complete period of indeterminate length. He's not using our Western modern logic. He's revealing spiritual images that carry meaning. He's looking at the vindication of martyrs, and that martyrdom chains Satan. History shows that is always true. Now, with that in mind, we leave aside millennialism as perhaps looking at this whole thing the wrong way. And we go on to look at the last little bit of the book of Revelation, which brings it all together and shows us what John was seeing.